Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How is month 9 of quarantine going for you? If you are indeed in quarantine, has it turned your brain to mush like it has mine? I'll tell you what, today's guest was a good guest to talk to while I could barely put together two thoughts. One of the most academic, learned guests I've had on in a long time. Yes, today is Chris Hedges. If you don't know who Chris is, why don't I read you his bio very quickly. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who was a foreign correspondent for 15 years for the New York Times, where he served as the Middle East bureau chief and Balkan bureau chief for the paper. He previously worked overseas for the Dallas Morning News, the Christian Science Monitor, and NPR. In addition, he writes a weekly column for the online magazine ScheerPost and is host of the Emmy Award-winning RT America show On Contact. Hedges, who holds a Master of Divinity from Harvard University, is the author of the bestsellers American Fascists, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, and was a National Book Critics Circle finalist for War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. He has taught at Columbia University, New York University, Princeton University, and the University of Toronto, and currently teaches college credit courses in the New Jersey prison system. So on the show, I tend to mostly talk to musicians and comedians and actors and TV writers. But every so often, I try to wander off of that. Especially in the last 4 years, I have become extremely interested in the origin stories of people in politics or the origin stories of political writers. And I admire Chris's writing immensely, but I also admire him a lot. He has a lot of integrity and is a very clear-headed, honest writer, very clear-headed, honest person. And so I went into this talk with kind of like a twofold purpose. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about how we got to where we are here in the 21st century. And I've been trying to put the pieces together, and I thought, hey, look, it's on topic, beginnings, in some way. But I thought Chris was a particularly good person to kind of have a discussion about that with, and also use that as a way to get into talk about his childhood a little bit. And the other thing, the other purpose I went to this with is, because I think Chris is someone with a lot of integrity. Not only integrity, but also someone who's courageous enough to really sacrifice important things in his life in order to maintain that integrity. One of the things I was really curious about was, how did he become that kind of person? This one's not I wouldn't call this one a laugh riot, but I think it's extremely interesting. And, the other thing is, I mostly release these episodes in chronological order, and I have a long backlog because I recorded a ton of them in quarantine because I have nothing else to do. Let me amend that. I have lots of things I'm supposed to be doing, but recording podcasts is a lot more fun than writing scripts. But I just talked to Chris just a couple weeks ago. It just seemed like this was very timely. And especially because we discuss his column that came out that week in ScheerPost, which is called "The Ruling Elite's War on Truth," and I'll link to that in the show notes because I think it's well worth reading. But I thought it was fortuitous that it was published just as I was going to sit down with Chris to talk about how we got to this place in the 21st century, and I think part of that story is talking about how the concept of truth has become fractured and niche, along with every other concept in modern culture. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, if this is your first time listening to Beginnings, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you'd like to check out other episodes, you can do that at any place that's they get podcasts, but I think all of them should be up on Spotify, or you can get the MP3s at beginnings.libsyn.com. I've done hundreds of talks with people, like I said before, musicians and writers and authors and comedians and performers and lots of other people, artists. I can suggest some episodes for you, though, if you're here because Chris is a writer and you want some more writers like him. I've talked to David Sirota, Bhaskar Sunkara, who is the founder of Jacobin Magazine, philosopher Simon Critchley, Chuck Klosterman, Harry Matthews, Sam Lipsyte, John Ronson, Rick Moody, tons of other people. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can do that on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Amazon, Spotify, Google. I'm, of course, on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman. And amazing episodes coming up. Next week is Cy Spurrier, one of my favorite comics writers. Ian Mackay from Fugazi and Discord. Coming up, boy, I just talked to Mary Timony today from Helium and X-Hex, and just an incredible musician for the last 30 years. So stay tuned for that. But for now, let's talk to Chris. I mean, life in the 21st century I found to be a very weird existential situation where
I've been in those before, though. I was in Sarajevo, which was a pretty weird existential situation. So,
in what way? Like, how did it feel inside?
Well, I was getting hit with 300 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. No running water, no heat, no food. Yeah.
I mean, do you mind if I ask existentially, like, is it just surreal? Like, in a situation that's so out of the norm, I mean, even though you were a international journalist for decades, does it feel just a surreal feeling to be in such a strange?
Yeah, it does.
Do you ever get used to it, or is it just always surreal?
Well, they're always, anytime you're in combat, there are always moments that are surreal, always. You learn to navigate it. I mean, you kind of get addicted to it. You get addicted to the adrenaline rushes and everything else. So, but yeah, there are always moments that are, I mean, the problem is when you're often numb, a lot of the time. So you see amazing or like horrific. I mean, for instance, in Kosovo, I had to get into the back of a truck with 21 bodies. They were wrapped in blankets. And the charges were that the Serbs who had killed these Kosovar Albanians had mutilated them. Well, the only way to tell was to roll back the blankets and shine my mag light in their faces. But at the moment, it's almost clinical. It hits you later. So,
like, does that surreality ever leave you, or does it kind of change how you, like, existentially, how you walk through the earth?
No, it changes how you walk through the earth.
Because, one of the things I've been trying to piece together, I was talking with a friend of mine from grad school yesterday, and it's really interesting. I just was reading your new piece about the elite's war on truth.
Right.
Because something that I've been really trying to piece together is what happened. Like, to me, the Enlightenment died in World War II. The Holocaust killed the Enlightenment.
No, the Enlightenment died in World War I.
Really?
Of course, because the whole notion of inevitable human progress was shattered by World War I, not World War II.
So World War I destroyed Whiggish history.
Yeah, World War I was in all disciplines. So that's where you got Karl Barth, who suddenly arises, the Swiss theologian, attacking the positivism of the Rauschenbusch and the social gospel. That's where you got Hemingway, The Lost Generation. That's where you got Dada. I mean, no, it was World War One.
So it dies in World War One, and
Yeah.
now we've kind of been living in this, I guess, interregnum between paradigms. And I've been trying to, the fact that truth has become so, uh, I don't even know what word I want to use, but like our understanding of truth has become so fractured that it's tough for us to have any kind of even philosophical understanding, at least in pop culture, or at least in like regular culture, of like what it means for something to be true.
Well, because it's emotionally driven now, not intellectually.
And I don't know if that's just we're in this middle period before another paradigm takes over, or if this is just what it's forming into. But one of the things I'm really curious about, and I think you particularly might have some kind of insight into it, is there's a couple different people I read who went to divinity school. There's this blog I read called After the Future, and the writer he went to Yale Divinity School. You obviously went to Harvard Divinity School,
Right.
and a lot of people that I read that who have this kind of background see some kind of whatever happens next, right? We live in a time where there is no positive vision of the future, or at least no one in mainstream culture is articulating a real positive vision of the future. And I'm wondering if you see some positive vision of the future that includes a synthesis between what happened in the Enlightenment and a return to having a real faith in something larger than ourselves.
Well, this gets into a discussion of the Enlightenment, whether the Enlightenment was in fact a positive force or not. You have philosophers like John Gray who argue that the Jacobins and the Bolsheviks and even the fascists were the natural denouement of the Enlightenment. And I think there's a lot of credibility to that. Because the Enlightenment posits that you can educate people. Through education, people can be risen to a higher level. But of course, education doesn't work. And so you establish the Committee for Public Virtue. You start guillotining people right and left, like the Jacobins did, or the Bolsheviks did, or the Nazis did. So I think there were positives to the Enlightenment, but there was a very dark element to the Enlightenment, that the idea behind the Enlightenment being that the human race was somehow perfectible, that human nature could be changed. And that could come through education or re-education. And then when that didn't happen, that would come through coercion. And I think also, and this is, if you go back and read Auguste Blanqui, the great French revolutionary theorist and leader, the French imprisoned him during the whole commune because they were terrified he'd get into the city. But he argues that this whole notion of progress is crippling because it's not true, that societies move forward, move backwards. And I think that's right. So again, from the Enlightenment is this thing of the inevitability of human progress, which is a kind of self-delusion and creates a kind of complacency within the public. But I think that infected positivism and Hegel and so many of the academic disciplines up until World War II. But after World War II, it became impossible. I mean, we still believe in the myth of human progress, but among intellectuals, except for people like Pinker, who's a pseudo-intellectual, you can't sustain it.
Yeah. I mean, do you have like any kind of articulated thoughts about like what's like if we're living in the corpse of the Enlightenment in some way, like what's like a way out of that? Because I've just been I mean I'm a dilettante at this point because I left grad school to go into comedy, so obviously I am I read a lot of stuff, but it's not in any kind of
I know a few comics. I mean, who are usually very bright, but also some of the most depressed human beings I've ever met.
Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate. Like what and I've been trying to like really piece together some kind of understanding of the 20th into the 21st century to try to see what is the pathway out. And I'm curious if you have some kind of articulated vision.
Well, there isn't a pathway out. I mean, it's Lewis Mumford's Mega Machine. And we serve the machine; it doesn't serve us, and that's what's going to bring us down. All the systems managers throughout the technocratic society who know only how to serve the machine. That's all they know how to do. And when things go bad, they reconfigure the social structure to serve the machine. So when there's a meltdown in 2008, they loot the US Treasury to serve the machine. When, dropping a drill bit into the ground doesn't produce oil, they create fracking to serve the machine. When they deindustrialize American cities and turn huge sections of the working class into what Marx calls surplus labor, they create militarized police forces and a massive prison complex to serve the machine. That's all they know how to do, which is why, unless they're overthrown, we're finished.
Yeah. I mean, that honestly, one of the reasons why I respect your writing is because when I read it, I'm like, yeah, you're telling the truth that I think whatever story I'm trying to figure out about this time we're living in, I think one of the main themes is delusion.
Yeah,
and
of course.
You cut through the delusion. You have, I think, a lot of integrity. And you were able to say, like, no, look, let's be honest about where we are and what's happening. And I don't know if that's just out of like a desire for, if that just comes out of your integrity, or if that's like, no, if we're going to get out of this, we have to know the truth.
Well, you can't get out of it if you don't know the truth. I mean, if your solutions or quote unquote hope is based on self-delusion, it's not really hope, it's just fantasy.
Right.
So, I was a war correspondent. People had a very Pollyannish view of the world and themselves, didn't live very long. We had to make very cold assessments about what the weapon systems were at the end of that road and what their capacity to harm us were and respond. We didn't sit around Sarajevo, thinking that the Serbs would suddenly stop shelling the city the next morning. I mean, you cope with the reality around you, and then you respond to that reality. But of course, we're not doing that. And then if you get up and attempt to speak the reality, you're shut down or you're attacked because you're a cynic. I'm not a cynic. Cynics give up. But you're attacked for being a downer pessimist. I'm attacked like that all the time. I didn't invent climate change. I don't, read the science. I read it. It's terrifying. This is rooted in verifiable fact. The disintegration of the American empire and American democracy is rooted in verifiable fact. But people always prefer not to see it. Number one, because it's unpleasant. And number two, because if they acknowledge it, then at least at some level, they realize they have to respond. And it isn't going to be by voting for Joe Biden.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the thing that really is the engine behind this delusion, is a fighting against inertia. Like, if I really acknowledge this deep down, then that I have to change my behavior. It's the thing that's like driven me a little mad during the Trump era, where like the people who are so into like Russiagate and that kind of stuff, where it's like, if you truly believed that the president of the United States was a traitor, was like was a puppet of another country, you would act differently. You would do something about that as opposed to fundraise off of it.
Well, yeah, it's all a game. I mean, the Democrats have Russia and Trump. I mean, now they're coughing up Venezuela and Hugo Chavez's software. I mean, it's just spun off into, Ubu Ra territory on both sides. I mean, they're no different
Yeah.
because they're both complicit in destroying the country and surrendering power to global corporations and billionaires. They both do it.
Yeah.
And of course, they both spin fantasies to deflect attention from what's happened and from their complicity in what's happened. But that's dangerous. And now the media, which is, and I think Taibbi's book, Hate Inc., has kind of elucidated this quite well. He's on one side, he's got a picture of Sean Hannity, on the other, Rachel Maddow. And he's right that what they do is they silo the public into, I think Taibbi calls it packaged anger just for you. And then the New York Times is completely disintegrated as a news organization. It slogged the Russiagate stuff to death. And when they proved that there was nothing there, 2 years of this coverage, they turned around and decided the issue was race. Not that racism is not institutionalized and endemic within American society is, but it allowed them to ignore the neoliberal deindustrial austerity policies that have visited misery on at least half the country. And of course, that by not focusing on the real issue, they kept their advertisers and they kept access to the people they depend on. And so now we saw this horrible 10-part series on the caliphate, which was just audio snuff films by an imposter. There's no price to pay for that. And you read my article, this ridiculous posting for a correspondent in Moscow. I seriously did. It was sent to me by another former foreign correspondent for the Times. And I wrote back and I said, it can't be real. It's from the Onion, or it wasn't. And it's just a cartoon vision of Putin and Russia. It's that strategy is commercially viable, but it destroys the credibility of news organizations, and it creates such a huge divide that you can't communicate anymore between these demographics, which are both intentionally divided from each other and demonized.
Yeah. I mean, it's truly like, I called it an interregnum because I didn't know if this is what we're just living in until the machine falls apart, I guess, as you said, or if there is going to be some new paradigm that takes over. But like, I think this hyper normalized existence is true. Like, for anyone who has some kind of insight into what's actually going on, it's maddening a little bit. I don't know if that's how it feels for you.
Maddening. I think of the world I come out of, which is 20 years and, covering the war in El Salvador, or being in Gaza, or I would say not maddening, but alienating.
Yeah.
What is maddening is what we do to the poor. So I teach in a prison, and that is, I'm angry because these are people I care about, and we drive by these prisons every day. You're in Pennsylvania? Where are you?
I'm actually in Los Angeles now. I grew up in Pennsylvania.
Okay. Yeah. So, Pennsylvania is filled with these prisons. I visit Mumia Abu Jamal in a Pennsylvania prison. And that's the big employer. And you go in there, and on the sides of the walls, you see all these similar last names because it's the sons and the cousins, and they all work there. Keeping black and brown people in cages. So, when I see what we do to the vulnerable, then that's angering. When I look at the kind of landscape, it's just alienating because I feel alienated from the mainstream and from popular culture, and because I just find it trivial and self-deluded.
Is this something that just developed in you over the years of being a war correspondent? Did you always feel since I was a kid, I felt somewhat alienated from mainstream culture just from being like, I grew up Jewish in Pennsylvania. It's a very Christian area. And I just was alienated from like moment one of being like
Well, I
of
think
being othered.
any real intellectual is alienated because most people speak in the cliches and slogans which they're handed. I mean, you can see in a popular narrative, let's say Bush calling to invade Iraq, and they will use cliches, the next smoking gun can't be a mushroom cloud. But what's interesting is how people will then, they're bombarded with those cliches and then they begin to repeat them. Although they don't know anything about Iraq or the Middle East or anywhere else. So any intellectual, I mean, it's interesting when I teach intellectuals in the prison, these are students, I teach in the BA program through Rutgers University. So these students turn their cells into libraries. I mean, we're talking about really, really serious intellectuals. And as they get through, I mean, I have students who are finishing their Rutgers, summa cum laude. And they say that the problem with an education is that they can't communicate anymore, even with their own families. I think that's right. I think that's what happens with any intellectual. I'm talking about a real intellectual, not an intellectual that sells themselves to power, but an intellectual that actually strives to think independently and doesn't speak in the approved language they're given. Yes, I think any intellectual is by nature alienated from, and I would say that's also true for not just intellectuals, but great artists too.
I know that grad school warped the way that I think about things. Like I went into grad school, I studied philosophy, and I went in from an analytic program being like, there's something wrong with it. Like I'd studied a couple philosophers that I thought were really interesting, but most of it was just like this kind of post-analytic program that I felt like, I guess, is this the price I have to pay to do the good stuff? And then I got to grad school. I went to Temple in Philly, and my mentor just like opened up my brain, and it's just like, hey, here's a bunch of stuff. I studied like a lot of philosophy of science with like nonlinear dynamics and things that just like opened up my brain in a way that like I find it difficult to speak the same language anymore because I'm thinking in these like large scale kind of like not Hegelian exactly, but like these like, hey, how does culture change over time and what are the different threads and how do they contradict each other and all that kind of stuff. And it's not a way that people are taught normally to think.
Well, that's right. So and Chomsky makes this point. I mean, if you go on, let's say CNN for 6 minutes, and you actually begin to speak about ideas and superstructures, and you don't speak about them through the approved narrative and the approved cliches of that narrative, then you might as well be speaking Greek because you only have 6 minutes. So the very format of the media precludes any kind of actual intellectualism. It's impossible because the whole point of being educated is that you are taught to question assumptions and structures and values. But that requires time to deconstruct the dominant values. I mean, you use the word interregnum. This comes from Gramsci. I mean, Gramsci was the master of this. He totally understood culture as a form of social control. So the media landscape itself, and I would argue the internet itself, is designed to be anti-intellectual. That's why I'm not on social media. And I don't have a TV. And I live in a house filled with, last count is about 5,000 books. And I read every night. But sometimes not only at night.
I mean, is this like, have you always been like this? Was this just like your adult experience as a journalist? At what point, when you're growing up, do you get these values instilled in you?
Yeah, I do. I did, because my father was a minister and my mother was a professor, an English professor. And my father was involved. He was a veteran. He'd been in North Africa as a sergeant, World War II, came back from the war, a pacifist. And he was very active in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and the gay rights movement. His brother, youngest brother, was gay. So he had a particular understanding of the pain of being a gay man in America in the 50s and the 60s, and was very outspoken, and the church was quite censorious towards him because of it. So you can't, I read a lot of ethics, but you can't learn ethics. You can't learn morality. That you can't teach it.
Yeah.
You have to, it has to be shown to you. And, there's a term, I think it's Todorov, I can't remember, but he calls them invisible witnesses, these figures that stand up who you can't betray, even though they're gone. I mean, certainly my father would be one. So, I was hauled in front of the New York Times because I was denouncing the war. And when I was given my reprimand, it was in person. I was hauled into the office. And I realized that I could pay fealty to my career, but to do so would be to betray my father. And I couldn't do that. And I remember walking out of the building and realizing I was finished, not just at the Times, but as a journalist. Nobody was going to hire me anymore. But that what my father had given me was freedom, that I didn't need the imprimatur of the New York Times to tell me who I was. I knew who I was. I was my father's son. And I think that that's how, actual moral decisions or moral choice is passed on. It's passed on by those who you admire or care about standing up and paying a price. And if you're not paying a price, it's probably not moral.
I mean, that's the thing that kind of drove me crazy in studying ethics, like philosophical ethics, is that they wanted, especially in like this like analytic or post-analytic paradigm, they want just a bunch of rules that they can follow, and they want there to be a set of rules that are eternal, that like the Greeks could follow and that we could follow, and that's what ethics is. And so you can just turn yourself off and be like, well, is this do I have a flow chart that tells me whether this is ethical or not? That way you don't have to think about anything else. You can just
but none of those rules work when society breaks down.
Right.
For instance, in the Warsaw Ghetto, certainly among the survivors of the ghetto, the nurses who killed the babies before putting them on the transports were considered heroes. And it doesn't work. When society breaks down, those rules don't work. They only work in the false comfort of a well-organized civilization. I mean, Conrad writes about this, not just in Heart of Darkness, but in that great short story, Short Outpost of Progress. Primo Levi understands this especially when he writes about the Lodz Ghetto, that we're all Raskolnikov, not Raskolnikov, that's Dostoevsky. We're all, who was the head of the Lodz Ghetto? Name escapes me, but he essentially was a tool. He was a tyrant and a tool of the Nazis. This is going to drive me nuts for the rest of the program. So I'm going to have to pull it up on my Google. Otherwise, that's all I'm going to think about.
Oh, I think our brains work the same.
Rumkowski. It's Rumkowski. We're all Rumkowski, and that, of course, I think is the power of a writer like Primo Levi or Conrad or even Dostoevsky, is they understood how thin that line is between the victim and the victimizer, how easy it is to become seduced by power, especially when those standing before you are utterly powerless. And that's important, those lessons, and not, I think, because what they're examining is the evil within. And when you understand your own capacity for evil, it's easier, or at least you have the understanding, the self-understanding to fight against it. That's what's important. And of course, in demagogues or with the Christian right, who I attack as fascists because I think they are fascists, evil is always externalized in the other. So, we have to destroy Muslims because they're satanic, or, secular humanists, or whoever it is. But that externalization of evil. I just watched Taxi Driver for the first time. I don't watch a lot of movies. That was kind of brilliant. But I thought it captured exactly that. He comes back from Vietnam and he's just possessed by these demons that he can't cope with, but he externalizes them on everyone around him. I think that's true, which is why it's a great film.
Yeah. Yeah. But yes, it's this kind of, do you think it's this inability to grapple with the truth oneself, and so it becomes externalized? Because I've been trying to think about this, like the kind of the way the right wing projects their own problems and insecurities and everything onto everyone else, like you said.
Oh, that's Hofstadter's, the paranoid style of American politics, where everything that is internalized within them, they immediately project on everyone else. So, Trump is running around saying they stole the election because that's what Trump would do. Thank God he's so inept. The next time around, we won't get an inept fascist. We'll get a competent fascist like Tom Cotton or somebody, and they'll steal it.
Yeah.
That's going to be the gift of Joe Biden.
Yeah, that's why my friends who are like excited, I'm like, that if he just does exactly what he's supposed to do, in 4 years, it's just going to be a terrible fascist, right?
Yeah, he wants to go back to normal. Well, that means the technocrats on the two coasts want to go back to normal. Well, the rest of the country doesn't want to go back to normal because normal is pretty awful.
Yeah.
And the liberal class has just committed self-immolation, so it has zero credibility, because every election cycle it cheerleads for Democratic Party candidates who oppose everything they claim to stand for, whether that's endless war or, Biden's a racist. The guy was a segregationist and anti-busing, and it was awful. And so at a time of distress, this is just classic when societies break down. Nope, liberals are just figures of ridicule, as they should be. This was true in Weimar. It was true in Yugoslavia when I covered the war. They won't stand up for anything. It's all rhetoric. But they won't take any risks. They won't vote for the Green Party, which has a platform that is far more akin to, what most of the liberal establishment claims they support. Biden said he wouldn't support the Green New Deal. He won't support Medicare. It's endless. So
yeah,
the problem is that you have a short-term gain where, Trump is obviously repugnant and frightening, and I'm happy he's gone. But the cost of that was that the liberal elites have eviscerated their credibility at a time when they're going to really need it. And then you read Richard Rorty's last book, Achieving Our Country, where he, I think, lays out quite presciently that and this was true in Yugoslavia and it was true in Weimar, you turn on that bankrupt liberal elite, but it's not just that you turn on the elites, but you turn on the purported values that they claim to defend. And that's how you get fascism. We'll get fascism in the cloak of kind of a Christianized fascism. That's who these people are. And they're very well funded by the most retrograde forces of American capitalism, Tyson Foods, Purdue. They have a wash in money that's why they put millions into Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, not because she's against abortion. They don't care about abortion or gay rights or anything else. They know that these people are, like the Nazi Party, will abjectly serve corporate power and crush the workers. So most of the cases that come to the Supreme Court don't have anything to do with these social or societal, let's call them societal issues. They're not social issues. They have to do with corporate power. And, when you have this ideology of the prosperity gospel where the rich are rich and the powerful are powerful because they're blessed by God. And Trump is somehow the reincarnation of Cyrus, who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem and allowed the Jews to return. And poor people or people in prison are in prison because they're not right with Jesus. Boy, that is a gift to unfettered capitalism. And that's why they support it. That's the real reason they support it.
Yeah. I remember David Sirota, I think, did the whole thing where he looked into Amy Coney Barrett's all the case that she adjudicated upon, and they're
Right,
all
55,
like they're all
55 cases as a circuit court judge dealing with corporate power, and she ruled in favor of corporations 76% of the time.
Yeah. How do you look, knowing this stuff, knowing the dynamics? Obviously, there are novelty. Any kind of complex system, novelties can be introduced that change everything. But in absence of something surprising coming along, we kind of know where things are headed. And I just live with this dread. It just like kind of lives in my spine or wherever. And I acknowledge it every once in a while, but it's mostly just kind of like passively sitting there. I don't know if you feel dread as well, but I'm kind of curious about like.
I feel daily despair. Of course, I have kids.
I mean,
my son's favorite book is Out of the Blue. It's pictures of narwhals. And I'm thinking, in your lifetime, probably every single one of those creatures will be dead. Of course, if the oceans go, and they're going, we're finished as a species. We can't survive.
Right.
So, of course, I feel despair. I feel all of that. But I don't let it cripple my resistance. I resist. But, I don't have any particularly Pollyannish belief that I'm going to succeed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is this kind of like existentialist feeling that I live in, which is like, well, yeah, you have to create your own meaning. You may not be facing a positive vision of the future, but you still have to fight for the values you believe in. Well,
it's more than that. I mean, it sounds like there's a leaf blower attacking me. I need to get my RPG. All right, that's Princeton. That's what we do in the afternoon. Yeah, but when you have real relationships with oppressed peoples, let's say the Palestinians in Gaza, let's say, the students in the prison, then it becomes personal. So you don't walk out of a prison. If you don't walk out of a prison angry, then you're not human. And I can walk out and they can't. So I get out and fight because I'm angry. Not because I'm going to succeed, but just because of what's done to people I care about. And I think that too often in the left, the oppressed are an abstraction. I saw this, when I was talking to Cornel West a while ago, and he asked me, of all your experiences, what was it that shaped you the most? And of course, I've been all over the world. I tried to count. I think I actually filed stories from over 50 different countries. And I said it was graduating from college and moving to Roxbury in Boston, which was the a depressed inner city part of Boston. That was the most, because as a white person, I finally understood institutional racism, how every institution, the probations, the courts, the schools, the police, are designed to keep the poor, the banks, all of them. But you got to live there to see it. And then you've got to see the consequences of that. And when that happens, you understand your country in a very different way. It's why I think James Baldwin is arguably the most important writer on America. And that if you really don't read Baldwin, you don't understand the United States. So my entire view of the United States is through the prism of race because of that. And that really shook me up. I think, began to understand power, the nature of the United States, the DNA of the United States, because you have to remember that when I went overseas and covered imperial power. Imperial power is just the external expression of white supremacy. It's about the theft of resources, the subjugation of labor, and who are those people? They're people of color. They're intimately intertwined. I mean, my closest friend who we lost, unfortunately, James Cone, the great theologian, the most important theologian in this country since Reinhold Niebuhr, and everyone should read his book, Martin, Malcolm in America, Cross and a Lynching Tree. So here's a guy who, grew up in segregated Arkansas. He said he never met a white person who he felt had expressed any humanity towards him until he got to college. Who, as a little boy, as soon as it got dark, would stand by the window, and they didn't even have indoor plumbing, terrified because his father was a woodcutter and had a 7th grade education. He understood instinctively that black men out on the road in Arkansas in the dark sometimes never come home. I think the reason we bonded is because he understood that viscerally, obviously, but I understood it viscerally even if I came from a position of privilege, unlike him, because I covered empire, which is, in the end, it's the same satanic force.
I mean, I'm trying to think about, like, when you got hauled in front of the New York Times, right, to denounce the war, and you refuse. You talked about your father being an invisible witness, but like that kind of integrity doesn't form overnight.
No, but let's be clear. I don't want to pretend it was easy. I mean, I'll be honest. I was really nervous. My hands were sweating. I was not an easy moment for me. I mean, this is why I have such admiration for Glenn Greenwald. I mean, I just was appalled at how his editors and fellow reporters attacked him, not for the censorship. He posted the emails back and forth. It's undeniable that it was censorship.
Yeah.
But their response was not to respond to the textual evidence that he presented, but to attack him personally, which I also experienced. Hannah Arendt said, the only people you can trust are not those who say this shouldn't be done or this oughtn't to be done, just those who say I can't. And, I can't. But it wasn't easy. And I know it wasn't easy for Glenn because I went through it. I had a stable job. I'd won the Pulitzer Prize, or was part of a team of reporters that had won the Pulitzer. I had a pension and a good salary, not as much as Glenn's, but a good salary. And I also knew that my defiance would mean that no other newspaper was going to pick me up, that my career in journalism was finished. We didn't have, the internet was kind of nascent, and I'm not very tech savvy, but it was then Robert Scheer, another great American journalist, who recruited me immediately afterwards to start writing for Truth Day. He gave me a kind of another lease on life, but in fact, I was looking for jobs to teach high school. I was going to teach high school English and coach track. I used to be a runner. And that's what I was going to do. And you know what? I would have been happy doing that. I ended up coaching my son's cross-country team when he was in high school. That would have been a meaningful life for me. I don't in any way look down on. In fact, of course, like many intellectuals, my teachers I have pictures of my teachers on my wall. I mean,
yeah,
they, especially if you are, as you said, alienated, and these teachers become absolutely vital figures in terms of affirmation and in terms of exploration and intellectual development. And
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be the person I am if it wasn't for, but like my teachers in high school, my mentor in grad school, like, I mean,
yeah, that's right. No, I'm the same.
Whether that's good or bad, in my case, but like, so, I mean, do you have early tests of your integrity like that, earlier in your life?
Yeah, I mean, you do. I mean, for instance, although I was a fierce critic of the Salvadoran military regime, when I covered the war, the FMLN guerrillas could also carry out executions. They consider them orejas, that literally means ear in Spanish, but these are people they target as spies. And I was in a town where they lined up a bunch of people and killed them, and I reported it. And I was a young freelance journalist, and I sent the report to, I was writing for Latin America Press out of Lima, Peru, which was a very leftist news, and they refused to run it. And I quit, and I had no money. I mean, it was, there was a huge cost to that. So, part of it's a personality type, I think. Yeah. I mean, we're people like me who work for news organizations are always management problems. So I remember I covered the first Gulf War for the New York Times, and I refused to abide by the pool system, which meant that I was filing reports independently, which drove the Pentagon crazy. Rumsfeld was the head of Cheney was the Secretary of Defense, and Cheney drew up a list of reporters he wanted expelled before they invaded Kuwait, of which I was at the top of the list. They couldn't find me. I speak Arabic, so I was sleeping in the desert with Bedouins. And also they couldn't track me on cell phones, because in those days, the cell phones would only work if you got within close to a microwave tower. So I'd be up on the border with Kuwait. I'd actually have to drive back to a town that had a microwave tower and call in my story. And then, of course, I disappeared, and I would be sleeping with Bedouins, and they couldn't track me. Anyway, but at the end of the war, Johnny Apple, who was running the coverage, said, "I just have one question for you. What is it with you and authority?" And I said, "I don't have any problem with authority, Johnny, as long as they don't try and tell me what to do." And he said, "You dumb," I don't know if you can swear on your podcast.
Go ahead.
"You dumb fuck. What do you think authority does?"
Well, yeah, I mean, I've always had a problem with authority that has no justification for itself.
Authority, yeah. I mean, authority is always about its own self-interest at your expense. That's the very that's why the problem is always power. This is something the left doesn't get. The problem is always power. I mean, it's why, any real intellectual is always a heretic, no matter who is in power. So Carlos Franchi in the Cuban Revolution fights with Fidel, and then as soon as Fidel starts using power, abusing power, Franchi becomes a dissident. Ends up, I don't know if he's still alive, but he wrote a very good book called View of Dawn in the Tropics. But he had to flee and exile to Italy. And it's why Lenin, that famous boat where he put like 350 of Russia's most important intellectuals, including Berdayev, he shipped them off to Europe. I mean, Stalin liquidated them, but he shipped them off to Europe. So, I mean, any intellectual by nature is a gadfly and a critic of power. And this gets into Julian Benda's great work, The Treason of Intellectuals, where he wrote that, once intellectuals felt that they had to serve power the way they do at the Wilson School at Princeton. I guess not called the Wilson School anymore, since finally they figured out he was a racist.
Right.
But the Kennedy School and at Harvard, these people, they surrender all of their integrity to buttress power. This is what Benda wrote. That's why I called it the treason of intellectuals. You must always be opposed to power. Power is always the problem, no matter who exercises it.
But I mean, were you, like, when you were a kid, when you were a teenager or whatever, I could not articulate. It was inchoate in me, some kind of amorphous feeling of like, there's something wrong with authority, but I could not really figure out what it was until later. Were you like that?
Yeah, I think that's right. Because, I remember the first time I read Reinhold Niebuhr's Moral Man and Immoral Society. I read it. I had a great mentor I went to Colgate undergrad, and I had a great mentor, Coleman Brown, a remarkable man, great, great intellectual. But he had graduated from Princeton and then Union Theological Seminary and gone to Chicago and worked for 15. He worked in East Harlem and then Chicago as an inner city minister before he came to Colgate. So I remember him giving me that book, which wasn't for a course, and reading it. And I think I read it maybe 2 or 3 times as an undergrad because it gave me a vocabulary to describe my own sense of reality. That's what great intellectuals do. That's why I love Proust, by the way, which I've read 3 times, even though it's 6 volumes and like Dostoevsky, it takes a little while, like a few hundred pages to get into it, but it's worth it because Proust, on issues of grief and love and the changing of the self and time, gave me a language to describe what I knew was true. But yes, I think that, that we need to reach back to, or reach out. I mean, I have my differences with Noam over BDS and stuff, but Noam Chomsky is our most important intellectual. My whole understanding of imperialism, liberal elites and how they work all comes from Chomsky. I mean, I wrote a book, Death of the Liberal Class. I said to Noam, I should put your name on the cover. There's not hardly original thought in there. I'm leaning pretty heavily on Chomsky, but that's what you do. I mean, intellectuals build on each other. You're not isolated. And I think the power of great intellectuals or great artists is that they give you the language by which you can then articulate reality, which is key.
Yeah. I think Manufacturing Consent was the thing that blew it open for me.
Yeah. I mean, but Manufacturing Consent. Yeah. He's been such, I think all of us, I was talking to Cornel West about this. We owe such a debt to Noam, such a deep, deep debt. And his courage. I mean, he just, it's embarrassing. I go to France, everybody knows who Noam Chomsky is, and yet he's blacklisted. It's absolutely embarrassing.
Okay. This might be a weird question, but you can tell me if it is weird or not. When you were, going to divinity school, did you feel like that was a calling?
Yeah.
Like you actually felt whatever inside you that this is I don't know even how to articulate it really.
I felt that I was going to be an inner city minister and that I was going to stand with oppressed peoples within our society and do everything I could to fight against the mechanisms of oppression that were destroying their lives. So yeah, that was a calling. I mean, I was very influenced by the Brothers Karamazov, which was another book that had been given. I spent my college career reading a ton. When I went to Harvard, my GPA was not that high, not high enough to get into Harvard. And my Shakespeare professor wrote a letter of recommendation, said, well, he's read more than just about any other student I've ever taught. The problem is most of it wasn't assigned. That's how I used college. I know I read Karamazov at least twice. I never took a class that had Karamazov. So, I mean, that's how you should use college, by the way. If somebody gives you a piece of crap to read, like my son went to graduate school and my older son in French Lit at Columbia, and because he thought he wanted to read French Lit. Well, there was hardly a course that had any French Lit. It was all theory. It was all Derrida and Foucault. And well, I'm not even against theory, but you got to read Stendhal first. I mean, you have to read the. So, yeah, Karamazov, the Brothers Karamazov was an important book for me. And I think Zosima and, Alyosha and all these figures, and Dostoevsky was an important figure for me. So, yeah, it was a calling. I mean, I soured on the church. I was commuting from Roxbury. I lived across the street from the Main Mission Extension housing project, which at the time was the most dangerous in Boston. In fact, the street in back of the manse where I lived had the highest number of homicides of any street in the city of Boston. But I soured on Harvard. I soured on liberalism. I soured on people who were talking about empowering people they never met, who liked the poor but didn't like the smell of the poor, and who would go down to Nicaragua, this was under the Sandinistas, and pick coffee for a week and spend the rest of the semester talking about it, but would never get on the Green Line and go over to a housing project in their own city. And so I took the civil service exam to be a cop, because we had a very good cop who lived in the neighborhood, and I saw he was white, he was married to a black woman, but I mean, most of the cops were awful, but he was good. And especially since I knew most of the cops were awful, I thought, okay, I'll be a cop. I'll stay in the inner city, but screw the ministry. And I took the civil service exam. I got 98%, which should have gotten me a job, except the corrupt mayor at the time, Kevin White, and this was part of later, he was indicted by the FBI, including over this incident, gave all the jobs to his crony, the sons of his cronies in South Boston. So that was out. And then I dropped out of school and decided, I was always writing, that I would go and be a journalist in Latin America. So I studied Spanish at the Marino Language School in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Then I freelanced in Bolivia and Argentina. And I wasn't gonna come back and finish, but both my parents had seminary degrees and I had a full scholarship. And they just were apoplectic that I wasn't going to get my degree. So I came back and finished the degree. But then as soon as I graduated, I went to El Salvador to cover the war. And I went before my ordination committee. You have to be approved for ordination, at least in the Presbyterian Church, before you go to seminary, which is kind of smart. And so I went before the committee and they said, what's your call? Since you use the word call. And I said, well, I'm going to go to El Salvador and cover the war as a freelance journalist. And there was a long silence. And the head of the committee said, well, we don't ordain journalists. Now, my poor dad, who'd been a parish minister for over 3 decades, was seated outside the room. And I had to go out and tell him. But I'll never forget, my father said, well, he said, you are ordained to write. And, you know, that's what Baldwin said. Baldwin said he left the church to preach the gospel. And if you look at Baldwin's essays, look at just the titles, they're all sermon titles. Down at the Cross, you know, they're all sermon titles.
Oh, yeah.
There's more gospel in James Baldwin than in almost every theologian out there.
Was it intimidating growing up with your parents?
No, because, and it's a horrible thing to say, but I think by the time we're 15 or 16, I realized I was smarter than they were, which is a horrible feeling.
Yeah.
It's not they were both highly educated. Yeah, it wasn't an enjoyable thing to realize.
Do you remember that moment?
Yeah, I do.
Did it change your relationship with them?
Yeah, I think I was less impatient. Now, let's be clear. My mother was an intellectual. My father was highly educated. You know, they were not. But I realized just intellectually I was quicker. I absorbed more. Yeah, I was about 15 or 16.
Yeah, I think I was just a jerk to my parents. Like, I don't think it came with any kind of. I'm wondering if there's some kind of like. Obviously, you know, there's plenty of differences between us, but I'm trying to think about like, I was not patient with them.
I don't know how patient I was. And, you know, I was sent to boarding school when I was very young. And boarding school is kind of, at least in those days, was like Lord of the Flies. I was a scholarship kid at these horrible elite schools. And I'm not big, but I could be very caustic and acerbic, and I could easily make everyone in the room laugh at whoever it was who was taunting me, which is a form of bullying. And one of the reasons I really detested Christopher Hitchens was that I saw that aspect of myself in him. As I got older, because I could have a very biting wit at the expense of others, I really forcibly curbed it and stopped it. But it is a form of bullying. It is, and I didn't like Hitchens on many levels. I mean, I think there was no moral core to him at all. He was a talented writer, but the whole idea that he got drunk and wrote anything worth reading is bullshit. You don't write anything worth reading when you're drunk or high. Even Hunter Thompson knew that. Faulkner was a terrible drunk, but he didn't drink while he wrote. Yeah, I could be very cruel. And when I will reserve that cruelty for the powerful. I don't have any compunction about holding back against the powerful, but that's the only people that's appropriate to behave that way towards. But that comes from coming out of a boarding school culture where you're acculturated to be like that. And that's an aspect of myself that as I got older, I worked very, very hard to crush.
Yeah. Was there a moment where you like had a kind of epiphany where you're like, oh, I am being cruel. I can't do this anymore. I have to change.
I think it was after I stopped covering war, because in a war zone, I liked war correspondents. They're not prima donnas. Because if you're gonna, especially in Sarajevo, we had, I think, 45 foreign correspondents that were killed. When I covered the war in Salvador, 22 were killed, and there weren't very many of us. If you take yourself that seriously, then you don't do that kind of work. But it's a very military-like culture, which I kind of like. I used to be a boxer, and I kind of got tired of being hit in the head. I wasn't that good, but I was on the Greater Boston YMCA boxing team. But what I liked about it were the other boxers. And they could certainly stand up for themselves, not just physically, but in terms of, verbally. And that was also true among war correspondents. So in a way, I didn't have to curb that viciousness and that kind of very dark humor and all of that, because they could easily match it. But it's when you got out of that environment that you had to be careful, because you could really hurt people. So I think it was late in life. I think it was, when I got out of war zones. I mean, this is also true in the military. I mean, the form of humor is cruel, often sexual, by the way. I mean, very often. And so I suppose in some ways it was kind of an extension of boarding school, except these guys who covered war were really, truly tough guys, and women, and there was no gender difference there. But yeah, I think then, yeah.
Yeah. It's weird. Like, do you think it was just the class difference, perhaps, of boarding school that gave you some kind of like a little bit of distance so that you did not become like the rest of the people you went?
Because almost all the scholarship kids yearn to become like the rich kids. That the whole notion of these New England boarding schools is to train the plutocracy. And it works. And in fact, the kids who go in scholarship are even more slavish to the demented values that are fed to them. I'm very rare. Most people who come out of the environment don't rebel. Scholarship kids.
What was the difference? Is it just like coming
from? Again, it was kind of personal, maybe. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know that it was anything necessarily innately moral. I think part of it was just that I was ornery and difficult and didn't like anybody tell me what to do, and also saw through the crap. It's like every time the New York Times would send out a message about the New York Times family, it made me vomit. I mean, I said, I have a family, and believe me, the New York Times is not my family. And yet, so many people in the newsroom, very bright town, they bought the whole thing, and New York, they gave everything to the Times, and give everything to any institution, never going to give it back. So I'm not sure. I think part of it was just personality. But I would say, yeah, I was definitely the exception among the scholarship kids. Yeah, the scholarship kids all went on, did what they were supposed to do, and were vetted and approved and rewarded by the system, and made a lot of money and wasted their lives.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if it's just, look, there's just some kind of, our brains form in certain way, like that's just genetics or whatever, and developmentally. I wonder if seeing also your father as a anti-war protester, if that maybe set you up in a certain way. I mean, look, it's just armchair psychology.
Yeah, no, I think that was true. I mean, and my father and I had very different personalities. So my father was very gentle and very sweet, and he actually hated conflict. And so it cost him more. I mean, he was braver than I was. I liked conflict. But, people walked out of his sermons. Yeah, he paid for it. So I think that had a profound influence on me, of course, because in a way, watching people turn on my father made me angry.
Yeah. Chris, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I thank you so much. I really appreciate you talking to me.
Yeah, not at all.
Your writing's really important to me, and so thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, thanks for doing it.
Yeah, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh 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 bye.